This is Fran Miller for WebYeshiva, and we're talking about the step of the Seder called Korech. So this is the step where we make a sandwich of matzah and marror. Actually, in modern day Hebrew, when they talk about a sandwich, it has that same language, right? We talk about a karich. I think lichroch literally means to wrap something up, or to, right? When we talk about the binding of a book, we also call it a kricha. And so in this step, we've already eaten our matzah with a bracha, we've eaten marror with a bracha. In this step, we take an additional kizayet from the matzah, take a kizayet of the marror, we wrap them together, make some sort of sandwich, and we eat them together with no additional brachot. It's eaten while reclining. And it's kind of interesting to understand what's going on here, right? We've already fulfilled our obligation of matzah. We've already done marror. And now we're going to eat from these again. But this time, when we eat them, we're going to eat them together, right? And when we eat this, we say, some people say this before eating, and some people say it after, but we say this paragraph, right? Zecher lemikdash ke Hillel. We're doing this, we're eating this together in memory of the temple, like Hillel did. And we're told that in the time of the Beit Hamikdash, Hillel would make some sort of sandwich. And so we're doing this today to remember it. So we want to try to understand what's going on with this sandwich. Why are we eating these foods again, but this time together? And what are we remembering that went on in the time of the Mikdash? What exactly are we recalling over here? Okay, but before we get to what we actually eat, which is the matzah and the marror in the step, right? That's what our sandwich consists of. I want to talk about a central element of the Seder, or of this sandwich that would potentially be in the sandwich, but that today is missing. And that's the korban Pesach, right? The Pesach offering. They would bring a lamb, or a sheep or a goat, and it would be brought on Erev Pesach, so the day before. And that korban Pesach, that offering that they brought, needs to be eaten that night. And so essentially, right, you're bringing the korban Pesach on Erev Pesach. You're bringing this offering the day before Pesach, and you're eating it the night of Pesach, essentially at Seder night. And it was brought by families. They would join together in a group. The number of people per animal, according to what they could eat, right? And they would bring this Pesach, the Paschal lamb, right? They would bring this korban Pesach, and they would actually do the Seder, right? Everything that we do in Magid and telling the story and asking the questions, we'll see this was actually around the festive meal that they're eating. And it wasn't just the regular, I don't know, whatever you have at your Seder, right? The matzo ball soup. But it was actually one of the things they were eating there was the korban Pesach. And so a lot of what we're used to doing at our Seder was done in the time of the Beit Hamikdash, in the time of the temple, but with the Korban Pesach, with this offering as part of the meal. Okay, so let's start off by taking a look. Let's switch to the source sheet. Let's start off by taking a look at, I brought here a paragraph from the Haggadah. And and we say this in Magid, and we hear that the mitzvah of this night, of telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the exodus from Egypt, this mitzvah, we learn that we do it on this night, and because of the Korban Pesach, because of this offering that is then going to be eaten. So let's just read the paragraph. The paragraph says, Yachol mirosh chodesh. I might have thought that this mitzvah, the Torah says you should, right, teach the story of going out of Egypt. I might have thought this mitzvah began at Rosh Chodesh. We start talking about it from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Talmud lomar bayom hahu, but the Torah taught us on that day. So not that we begin from the beginning of the month, rather we do it on the day that we're bringing the Korban Pesach. And then the teaching goes on to say, so, okay, it has to be on that day, but I might have thought during the daytime, in other words, on the day of the 14th still, I might have thought you do this. How do we learn that this mitzvah of doing Sipor Yetziat Mitzrayim, of talking about the teaching our children, right, about the exodus of Egypt. How do we know that we do that on Seder night, right? That's so essential to what we do on this night. We all know that's what we do, but how do we know? So they learn it from the words ba'avor zeh. He's supposed to tell his children that we're doing this whole service because of this story, right? Ba'avor zeh lo, and what's this? This is something tangible he can point to. What's this? Ba'avor zeh lo amarti ela b'sha'a sheyesh matzah u'marror lefanecha. So when he said because of this, it's something he could point to, and it's what's he pointing to? He's pointing to his matzah, he's pointing to his marror. You do it at the time where your matzah and your marror, and in the times of the Beit Hamikdash, as we just discussed, your korban Pesach are in front of you. And so what we see here in this paragraph of the Haggadah is the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the exodus from Egypt, is specifically, when do we do this mitzvah? We're supposed to tell the story over food. We're supposed to tell it with visual aids. And because of that, right, because we want to have these foods there present at the table, and they're so essential to what we're doing on this night, we want to be able to point them and show them and feel them and experience them. Because of that, the mitzvah is going to happen on the night of the 15th, when we're eating in the times of the temple, right, when we're eating the korban Pesach, and along with those foods, we're eating the matzah and we're eating the marror. These foods are essential to what we're doing on this night. And the shibulei haleket here just gives a little more nuance of, you might have thought, right? We might have thought that what the mitzvah was to do it. Certainly, it goes along with the korban Pesach, right? The whole pasuk in the Torah that teaches us you should tell your children, you should explain to them what's going on, is with regard to the korban Pesach. But I might not have known exactly at which stage to do it. It might have been, well, I was sacrificing the korban Pesach, then the mitzvah would be on Yud Dalet, right? What we call Erev Pesach, the day before. It might have been, it's different stages of bringing this sacrificial lamb. But we learn over here, it's ba'avor zeh. It's when these foods are sitting in front of you on the table, when you're sitting down to eat. Okay, and so we see here that the mitzvah specifically with the eating of the korban Pesach, that's when we're going to tell over the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And the korban Pesach played this is something that, it's a little bit removed from our mentality today, or from our awareness. We don't have the korban Pesach. We just have the matzah and marror, which we're going to talk about shortly, or actually the accompaniments to the korban Pesach. But the korban Pesach, along with these other foods, played a really central role in the Seder. And it's interesting. I want to take a look at the Mishnah in Arvei Pesachim. And the Mishnah, in Arvei Pesachim, the Mishnah goes through basically in chronological order, explaining what happens on Seder night, right? So a lot of the things that are here are steps that, not the step we're talking about right now of Korech, but steps hopefully you've heard about, right? Steps that were in the other sections, right? We make Kiddush over the cup, and it talks about Karpas, and it talks about marror, a lot of the different steps. But when it starts off the section of Magid, so the section starts off with the pouring of the second cup, because basically we're going to do Magid, we're going to say Magid over the second cup. And how does that section open? So the Mishnah says, Kan haben shoel aviv. This is the place right now that we've poured the second cup. This is where the son asks his father, and what's the son asking his father? So we know that this is where, right, we have the Manish Tana, we have the what we call the 4 questions. But I want to read to you the version of the question they had in the time of the Mishnah, because you'll see that the original questions of the Manish Tana were a little bit different than what we say today, and actually included the 3 central elements we're going to be talking about here in Korech as this set that goes together. It includes the Pesach, matzah, marror. So let's just read the questions for a minute. Okay, so what does he ask? Manishtana laila zemikol alelo, right? This part's familiar to us. What is different to us about this night from all the other nights? Shebechol halelot anu ochlim chametz umatzah. Halayla hazeh kulo matzah. All other nights we eat, right, chametz, right, leavened bread and matzah. Tonight we only eat matzah, the unleavened bread. Okay, good. That was our matzah element that we're going to see right in our Korech sandwich. Shebechol halilot anu ochlim shtar yirakot halayla hazeh marror. Right. So then he asked, on all other nights we eat all sorts of vegetables. Tonight we eat bitter herbs. So that's the marror in our sandwich. And look at the next question here. This question is different. So we read a little bit more slowly, less familiar text. The question says, Shebechol halilot anu ochlim basar tzli shalu u'mevushal. Halayla zeh kula tzli. Okay, so today we don't have a question about the meat because we're not eating sacrificial meat at our Seder. And instead, to keep sort of with the structure of the 4 questions, this question has been replaced with the question about reclining. But in the times of the temple, the question that the son would get up and ask, he's asking the questions about the foods that are on the table. So he asks about the matzah, which we would see on our table. He asks about the marror. And the third question here is a question about the korban Pesach. And the korban Pesach, we're going to see the verses in just a minute. The korban Pesach has to be roasted, right? That's called sli esh, roasted. And so the son asked, other nights we eat meat cooked in all sorts of ways. It could be stewed, it could be boiled, right? It could be in a liquid, it could be made prepared all different ways. But tonight we only eat roasted meat. And so that was the question, right? And then just the 4th question is the question we know similar to ours, right? About the question of dipping. So in the times of the Mishnah, or in the times of the temple, the original questions of the Manishtana included all these 3 elements: our Pesach, our matzah, and our marror, which are all the foods of the night. This just reiterates the point that the key elements of the Seder night, right? The key foods are matzah and marror, as we know, and the korban Pesach played a really central role here. And these were the unique Seder dishes. Now we know that the mitzvah of Seder night is phrased actually in an interesting way, right? It doesn't just say you should talk about the story of going out of Egypt. It actually says you should tell your children, ve'igata lebincha, right? You should tell your children. And there's an idea here of involving the children. And what we want to do, right? And this is, you can give a whole another share on this in and of itself. But what we want to do here is we want to kind of pique the kids' interest. We want to get their attention because then we have someone to talk to in order to be able to fulfill this mitzvah of telling over the story. We have to first create some sort of connection, create some sort of curiosity. And so what we see here is that it's actually these special dishes, right? The food that's being put out in an unusual way, or an unusual food, or prepared in an unusual way. It's these foods that are unique to Seder night and are noticeably different than the other nights that are prompting this discussion here, right? And namely the Pesach, matzah, marror. And so again, we see this central element of these 3 types of food. And in fact, these elements, Pesach, matzah, and marror, were so essential that Rabbi Gamliel comes along and he claims that if one hasn't mentioned these 3 things, one has not fulfilled his obligation. And again, this is also familiar to us because it's quoted in the Haggadah, right? This comes up also in Pesachim, but it's brought in the Haggadah because essentially, right, what our Haggadah is, and you kind of see this even from the source sheet, is the Haggadah that we say in Magid is essentially a collection of different teachings as they pertain to the mitzvot of this night, as they pertain to the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? So we quote this teaching over here of Rabban Gamliel, and so we say this, right? This is the point where I don't know if other people remember this, but I always remember my father making sure everyone's paying attention, calling people in from the kitchen and from the other rooms, right? You really have to be there. Why? Because what Rabban Gamliel said is, Rabban Gamliel haya omer kol shelo amar shosha dvarim elu bepesach lo yatsa yedei chovato. I'm reading in source number 4. Rabban Gamliel would say, if you haven't said these 3 things on Pesach, right, you could be sitting around the table all night, you could do all the things you're supposed to do, except for this, you could be talking about other things. If you haven't mentioned these 3 essential elements, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. And what are these 3 things you have to mention? Eluhain, these are the 3 things, Pesach, matzah, marror. You have to mention the Pesach, which is the offering of the korban Pesach. You have to mention the matzah, and you have to mention the marror. Now, there's a question that comes up here in Rabban Gamliel. What's he saying, right? What do you actually have to do? You just have to say these words, right? You have to say Pesach, matzah, marror. What exactly do you have to do? And so if we go on and read Rabban Gamliel goes on and gives an explanation for each of these things. And so according to some explanation, what Rabban Gamliel is saying is it's not enough that tonight I'm going to eat matzah, that tonight I'm going to eat marror, that tonight I'm going to eat the korban Pesach, but I need to explain why I'm doing that, right? So according to that, he doesn't just mean saying these three things, but he actually means the discussion around these foods that I'm eating, right? We know we have to eat them, but we actually have to say them, and we have to explain why we're doing it. And that's kind of unique because usually when we have a mitzvah, we have the mitzvah, right? If we have a mitzvah to do something, we have mitzvah where we're supposed to say something, and we have mitzvah where we're supposed to do something. But usually when we have a mitzvah, we're supposed to do something, so doing it is enough, right? When I take lulav and etrog, there's all sorts of intentions I can have, and if I want to have a spiritual experience, I should understand what I'm doing. I should know what I'm doing. But from the just straight letter of the law, if I want to fulfill my obligation in lulav and etrog, so I'm pretty sure, right? I haven't looked into this extensively, but I think, right, what you have to do is you have to pick up your lulav and etrog and you have to do the mitzvah with it, right? Or let's talk about other eating mitzvah, right? If we have a mitzvah to eat something, so normally you just have to eat it, right? This is kind of an interesting combination here, where what Rabban Gamliel is telling us is we want to eat these foods, and at the same time, while we're eating them, there's a mitzvah to give an explanation for them. And let's read his explanations. Pesach. So when you say the korban, when you have to have the korban Pesach, you have to mention the korban Pesach. And what are you supposed to say about the Pesach? Pesach, right? The Paschal lamb, the sacrifice of Pesach. Shayu avotinu ochlim bizman shebeit hamikdash haya kayam al shuma. So the Pesach that we don't have at our table today, right? And we don't point to something specific on the table for this part of the reading because we don't want to make it look like we do. But the Pesach that they would eat in time of Beit Hamikdash, so why are you eating them according to Rabban Gamliel? Ashum shepasach hakadosh baruch hu al batei avotenu b'Mitzrayim, shene'amar v'amartem zevach Pesach hu la'Hashem, asher pasach al batei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim b'nukfo et Mitzrayim, v'et batenu hitzil v'yikoda am v'shtachavu. So he explains that the korban Pesach was eaten, notice the language here, to remember that Hashem pasach, that Hashem skipped over the houses of our ancestors. This is referring to during Makat Bechorot, during the plague of the firstborn. God saved the Jewish people and he passed over their houses while he was afflicting the Egyptians, but we were saved. So that's why at the time of the Beit Hamikdash, they would eat the Pesach. Matzah zu shanu ochlim al shuma. Why do we eat the matzah? And this we can actually point to matzah on our table, right? Because we actually do eat that. Al shum shelo histik b'tekam shel avotinu lachmitz ad shenigla alehem melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu ugalam shemar ve'afu et habatzik asher htziu mitzrayim ugal matzo ki lo chametz ki garshu mitzrayim v'lo chlu et mameh v'gam tzida lo asalem. So why do we eat the matzah? So here we mention that the matzah that we're eating is because when our ancestors were going out of Mitzrayim, their dough didn't have time to rise, right? They were chased out so quickly. I think this is there's a lot of actually different explanations of matzah. I think this, and hopefully in the matzah step, you'll talk more about that. You talked more about this, but this is the one that I think all kids probably learn. That they were leaving with their dough on their backs and it didn't have time to rise. They just took it with it and baked as this flat type of bread. Okay, so we remember the hurry in which they were to get out. And marror, why do we eat this? Wait, we remember the way the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors in Egypt. Okay, and it goes on to quote psukim about that. And so what we're seeing here from Rabban Gamliel is that these foods we have two different things going on during this night. We have eating the Seder foods, and we have telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and they actually go hand in hand. And this is sort of like a multi-sensory experience here on the Seder night, where the food is actually serving as props to help us tell our story, right? Or even to help experience the story. And so Rabban Gamliel says it's not enough just to eat these things, but we actually have to tell them. But we see, right, when we talk about these elements that are meant to be there, that we're meant to be explaining, that we're meant to be telling the story over. So the korban Pesach, right, the Pesach offering plays a central role, obviously alongside matzah and marror, but we'll see that even certainly the marror, right, the bitter herbs were actually just an accompaniment to this korban Pesach. And so the korban Pesach played a really central role in the holiday. And in fact, right, what do we call the holiday? We call it Pesach, right? Like the korban, like the offering. And so we can't talk about the Korech sandwich, right? I know it's not in our sandwich today. We think of the matzah and the marror, but we can't talk about this sandwich without remembering this really important element that used to be in it, that was involved, or that used to be alongside it. We'll see the different opinions that was involved there. And it's just also interesting to think about sort of the contrast between what our Seder looks like today and what it looked like in the time of the time of Beit Hamikdash, where on Erev Pesach, right, in addition to everything else we're running around doing Erev Pesach, they're actually bringing this Pesach offering, and the Seder was said over the meal that was part of this Pesach meal, right, with this korban Pesach, with the matzah, and with the marror. Okay, and that, now let's talk about the idea of eating them specifically. We understand that all these three things are going to be on the table, but where did we get this idea, right? So bring it back to Korech. Where did we get this idea that these elements are supposed to be eaten together, right? Why are we making a sandwich specifically? So where did we get this idea from? So first, I just want to see the verses in the Torah that describe the way that korban Pesach is meant to be eaten. Okay, I think we're not going to read the whole thing, but basically what we have is, so this is source number 5. We have Shmot Yud Bet is the original commandment about the korban Pesach. This is actually the commandment the Jews are given while still in Egypt. So remember, they're supposed to take the lamb into their house for 3 days, right? And they get all these other instructions that are specific to that time about painting the blood on the doorposts so that their houses will be skipped over in Makat Bechorot. But many of the halachot here about how they eat it actually end up being the halachot for the future generations about how we bring the korban Pesach. And it even says over here, right, where is it exactly? Right, it lists a bunch of halachot. We're going to read them in a second. And it goes on to say, right, you should keep this mitzvah for the generations, right? So a lot of these halachot that we're told over here about how to bring the korban Pesach, here it is. Let's see, Pasuk Yud Zayin. It's a few places here, but Yud Zayin, right, says, Ushmartem et hayom hazeh l'dorotechem chukot olam. So even though essentially, right, most of what's going on over here is the original command of the korban Pesach, but we're told here you should keep this day for the generations forever. And the halachot that are said over here, some were, again, painting the blood on the doorpost, I think was Egypt specific, but the halachot of how to eat the korban Pesach were, in general, right, this is where we learn the halachot of the korban Pesach for future generations. And I just want to show you those halachot because they're going to be really central to our discussion here of why we're making them into a sandwich. So let's see Pasuk Chet. So the psukim before this are describing you should bring set tamim zachar ben shana, or you should bring a 1-year-old sheep, umena izim, or a goat. Okay, let's skip to pasuk chet, to verse 8. V'achlu et basar b'layla hazeh. You should eat the meat that night. So you bring it during the daytime, like I said on Yud Daled, you eat it at night. And how do you have to prepare it? There's very, very specific instructions here. You can't just eat it any way you like, but you should prepare it tzli eish, roasted. Right, so like sort of dry roasted on a spit. Matzot al merurim yochluhu. And how should you eat this lamb? You should eat it with matzot, with matzah, on marror. Okay, and it goes on to describe other halachot. Al tochlu mimenu na. You can't eat it raw. Bashal mevushal b'mayim. You can't eat it cooked in water. So again, reiterating this point that it has to be ki im tzli eish. It has to be roasted, and it describes, right, how you have to fold up the animal in order to roast it. Roshal karval kirbo, right, you tie it up. Other halachot of eating it also, that you can't leave over from it. Lo totir mimenu ad boker v'notar mimenu b'boker b'eish tisrafu. If anything's left over, you have to then burn it up. It has sort of like a time, many korbanot have this, right? There's a specific timeline or an expiration date for the korban. This particular korban has to be eaten by the end of that night. And that's what you're supposed to do. And then we get into things that are a little bit more Yetziat Mitzrayim specific, where they're told to eat it in a way that they're ready to go out, right? They're ready, they have their shoes on, they have their belts on there, they're ready to go. That is eat it very quickly. That's a going out of Mitzrayim thing already. But we see here the mention of alongside the Korban Pesach, you have matzah and you have marror. Okay? And just to show you that, again, this comes up elsewhere, the same exact description. So in addition to the regular Pesach offering that's brought on Yudala Nisan, what happened in Sefer Bamidbar is there were certain people who weren't able to make it, they weren't able to bring this korban on the 14th. They were impure, for example, or sometimes there might be someone who is too far away to make it to the Beit Hamikdash. This korban has to be eaten in Yerushalayim, which means everybody who's doing this is staying over in Yerushalayim. So the Seder night that we're talking about is in Yerushalayim. So there were people who weren't able to do it, and they went to Moshe and they said, we don't want to lose out on this mitzvah. And a new halacha was brought about through this discussion, which is called Pesach Sheni, right? That a month later, there's a second opportunity if you miss the first Pesach. And so this isn't where, most of the nation is bringing the Korban Pesach, but individuals who weren't able to would bring it. And just to note that over there, we have the same exact halacha. Look at Pasuk Yud Aleph. So we're going to do this B'chodesh HaSheni. So this is now the second month starting from Nisan, right? A month later in Iyar, on the 14th day in the afternoon, Yasu Ocho. Al matzot u'murim yochluhu. You should eat it with matzah and with marror. Should be eaten. Okay, again, similar halachot of how to eat it, don't leave over from it, things like that. But in both these places, we see that the way the Korban Pesach was eaten was together with matzah and with marror. And it's a question how to understand this together, right? Eating it together. And the Tosefta tells us that Hillel would actually make them all into a sandwich, like really eat them together in the same bite, right? Not just on the table at the same time. So the Tosefta is talking about the marror and the matzah and the korban pesach on that first night that you're obligated to eat these. And then the Tosefta says, Hillel hazaken haya korcham shlashtan zeh b'zeh v'achlan. Hillel would put all three together and eat it. I was reading a little bit up on this. Maybe someone here knows more than I do about this, but there's I think this urban legend, right, that the Earl of Sandwich invented the sandwich. So I was reading a little bit about this on a history site, and they say the Earl of Sandwich didn't invent it, right? We know people were eating sandwiches for much longer. It seems like he popularized it or something, but anyway, this is what people think. But he popularized it. But anyway, this article, on a regular secular history site was saying we know of, more ancient people eating sandwich. For example, Hillel, the elder, right, in the times of the temple, would make this sandwich. So I thought it was an interesting reference. Okay, so who really invented the sandwich? I don't know exactly, but there was definitely some concept of eating these foods together in the time of Hillel's time. And he would eat these three things together as a sandwich. And what it comes down to is actually a question how to understand that verse we saw. So we saw this verse where the Torah tells us, al matzot umurim yochlu, should eat with matzah and marror. And how are we going to read that with matzah and marror? So the Gemara in Pesachim brings two different opinions of how you actually eat this. Let's see from down here. Let's find the start here. Here. Okay. So the Gemara is in the middle of a halachic discussion, and the halachic discussion is, I think we're not going to go into it so much, but the halachic discussion is, does one mitzvah cancel out another? Can I fulfill multiple obligations at once? And so for, the purpose of this discussion, the question is not talking about the way we do it today, where we've already done our matzah, and we've already done our marror, and now we're doing korech as an additional step. But what Hillel would do, right, is he has these different things he's obligated to eat. He would stick them all in a sandwich and eat them all together. And so the Gemara, right? And some people would say that's not good because the different mitzvot you're doing all at once cancel each other out. You can't eat matzah together with the marror. Each is its own mitzvah. You can't eat them together in a sandwich. But Hillel apparently didn't think this. And how do we know that Hillel didn't think that there's a concept of mitzvot canceling each other out? Well, because we have this Tosefta where it says Hillel haya korcham bevat echad ve'ochlam. Hillel would sandwich them together, would wrap them up together, and he would eat them bivad echad at one moment. He would eat them together, so he would fulfill his obligations all at once. And where did he learn this? So the Gemara tells us from the pasuk that we just read, al matzodu morim yochluhu. The Torah says you should eat the korban Pesach with matzah and marror, and he took that with as mamash together, right? Eating them together in the same bite. Right, so I've heard some people like to describe it as a lafa, right? You have your, if you imagine, not our matzot aren't so good for making sandwiches, honestly, right? And certainly not, right? I think kricha is more of like a wrap. Our matzot don't wrap, right? The challenge is to spread things on them without them cracking or whatever. Not the best sandwich material, but if he ate more like certain, right? I think the temanim have like the soft matzot. If you had more of a soft matzah, so you can imagine like a loaf of bread in Israel or like a big pita, right? And with that, right, it's actually the perfect sandwich. He has his meat, he has his vegetable, wrapped it up in his bread, something like that. Hillel would eat them all together based on this pasuk. And Rabbi Yochanan says, right, Chachamim didn't agree with Hillel because that mitzvot don't cancel out each other, because they actually taught that you should do these mitzvot separately. And how do they learn that? It says, you might have thought you should wrap them all together, or eat them all together like Hillel said, but they emphasize sort of the end of the pasuk. So the pasuk said, al matzot umurim yochluhu, you should eat it with matzah, with marror. They read it as it should be eaten, afilu zeh b'fnei atzmo v'zeh b'fnei atzmo. Right, so they read it as not you should eat them together, you have to eat them all at the same time, but you should eat it alongside, I'll say, right? Instead of with in the same bite, but you should eat it alongside of matzah, you should eat alongside of marror. But it seems that Chachamim were of the opinion that each of these things is being eaten separately, so much so that Rabbi Yochanan's claiming that maybe what they're saying is actually if you do eat them together, you don't fulfill your obligation because the mitzvot are canceling each other out. So what we see here is two different opinions, right? When the Torah tells us to eat the korban Pesach with matzah and with marror, there's two different opinions here what that actually means, right? And there's Hillel would put them all together, eat it as a sandwich, and Chachamim would eat them one at a time, but all in the same meal. And so that's the question, right? Is it a korban Pesach is eaten alongside these, I would say, like side dishes? Or is this telling us this is how you prepare the dish, right? When you eat the korban Pesach, it's with matzah and with marror. And so there's two different understandings here. So Hillel made this sandwich. He definitely invented the korban Pesach sandwich, we could say. He initiated this, and Chachamim disagreed with him. And it's not clear exactly how to read the disagreement, okay? It could be that it's, this extreme disagreement where he says you should do it as a sandwich, and they said you should do it separately. That's how Rabbi Yochanan read it. If we read a little bit more in the Gemara, Rav Ashi says what Chachamim are saying is you can do it separately. In other words, they think that you fulfill your obligation if you eat them together, but they're pointing out that even if you do eat it separately, right, they think you still fulfilled this verse, whereas Hillel thinks you have to do it together. Okay, so it's unclear. There's two different readings here in the Gemara between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Ashi. Unclear exactly how extreme the disagreement is, but Hillel thinks the way to fulfill this mitzvah is eating it together. Chachamim think they also may be eaten separately, or perhaps even should be eaten separately because of this issue that is brought up over here of mitzvot canceling out each other. Okay, now if you notice in our verse, right? So the verse is talking about, so that was, I'm skipping, source 9 was the Rashbam kind of giving the two perspectives on how to understand Shitat Chachamim. Is it like Rabbi Yochanan, that they're actually disagreeing and saying you have to eat them separately? Or is it like Rav Ashi who's saying, well, you can eat them separately, but they wouldn't object to eating them together. They just don't think that's the only way to do it. I'm going to skip 9. I'm going to skip 10. I'm going to skip to source number 11. But if you notice, right, the verse says you would. It's not exactly clear. Well, let's go back for a minute to this Tosefta actually. Right, the Tosefta is actually very clear. It says Korchan shlashtam ze b'ze v'ochan. He would eat them. He would eat all 3 of them together. The Gemara was a little bit less explicit, just said he would eat them together. And the verse the Gemara quoted mentioned matzah and mentioned marror. Now we saw the context, right? So mentioned the matzah, mentioned the bitter herbs. We saw the context that you're being told this is how to eat the korban Pesach. But what ends up being a little bit unclear here is what was actually in his sandwich. Was it Pesach matzah marror? That's how it sounds in the Tosefta. And that's what Rashi understands, right? Rashi gives us Hillel's sandwich recipe. So Rashi says, right, what would he make to wrap together in his sandwich? Pesach matzah marror, source number 11. He put the meat, he put his bread, his not bread, right, his matzah, and he put his bitter herbs together in a sandwich. However, right, the Rambam actually understood alongside his meat dish, right, his korban Pesach, he's eating a sandwich, and what's in his sandwich? 2 elements, right, the other 2 elements, the matzot and the marrorim, the matzah and the bitter herb. And if you read Rambam, right, he's not talking about the korban Pesach. It seems like according to Rambam, there's the korban Pesach outside the sandwich, and he's eating it alongside matzah and marror, which is what Hillel's sandwich. Hold on, where does he say this? Great, so he brings the bracha, achar kach, here at the end of the Rambam, Korech, matzah marror kachat. He put the matzah and the marror together as one thing. He doesn't mention 3 elements, he mentions 2. He dips it in the charuset, he says the bracha, and what does he say in this bracha? Al achilo matzot u'marorim v'ochan. So we said we don't say a bracha on this, but he says he would say al achila matzah u'maror v'ochan. Alongside the korban Pesach, he would eat a matzah and marror sandwich. So there's actually a disagreement here exactly what was in the sandwich. What's he combining? Did Hillel's sandwich look like our sandwich, which is, right, the matzah and the bitter herbs? Or did it actually have the meat in it, which I think is the more simple understanding, right, that looks clear in the Tosefta. And so Hillel, this was something he enacted, that he read the verse and he understood from the pasuk, maybe he had some sort of tradition, that the way, when the Torah tells us how to eat our korban Pesach, right, when the Torah tells us how to eat this offering, it's supposed to be eaten together with these things. It means really together in the same bite, right, in a sandwich. And something that's interesting, just a little biography on Hillel for a minute. Hillel was born in Bavel in Babylonia, and he later moved to Eretz Yisrael. And the Tosefta tells the story of when he became the Nasi. The Nasi was an important leader of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. After he moved to Eretz Yisrael, he became the Nasi, became the leader. And the Tosefta tells the story of how this happened. And what happened is there was a big question of one year, right? Pesach fell out that the korban Pesach was going to need to be brought on Shabbat. And they weren't sure. They had this question. The ruling body at the time was called the Bnei B'Tira. They were the Nisim. They were the heads of the Sanhedrin. And they weren't sure, are we allowed to bring the korban Pesach on Shabbat? And Hillel comes, and Hillel succeeds in answering the question. And he essentially learns, he compares the korban Pesach to other korbanot that we bring regularly on Shabbat, the korban tamid. And because of the similarity, he learns that this is permitted. But anyway, so Hillel succeeds in settling this big question surrounding the korban Pesach. And the Bnei B'Tira are so impressed with Hillel that he was able to do this. They're sort of humbled by this experience that they weren't able to answer, and he was. They actually stepped down from their position. They voluntarily resigned in order to give the position of Nasi, or I guess we could call it like the president, to Hillel. And so this is the story of when he becomes the Nasi. And it's also around an issue of the korban Pesach. And in fact, besides for this halacha, with regards to Pesach, we hear that Hillel established other halachot with regard to the korban Pesach. The Yerushalmi tells us this story. I don't think I brought it on the sheet, but the Yerushalmi tells us when Hillel moved from, he made aliyah from, right? He moved from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. He brought with him 3 halachot. He elucidated 3 different verses in the Torah, he taught 3 different halachot. And 2 of these 3 halachot, interestingly enough, pertain to the korban Pesach. One explains, we have a verse in the Torah that talks about, it says, V'zavachta Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha tzon ubakar. It says you should bring an offering to God, sheep and cattle. And so he said, what's sheep and cattle? So we tell that it's 2 different things. The sheep are brought for the korban Pesach, and the bakar, the cattle, were brought for another, just the festive offering of the holiday. It's called the korban chagiga. So that was one verse that he elucidated, basically clarifying, right, which animals can be used for which things. So what is used for the korban Pesach and what's used for other korbanot. And a second halacha that he taught also has to do with the halachot of eating matzah on Pesach. There's a little bit of it looks like maybe a contradiction in the Torah. One verse talks about eating matzah for 6 days. And another verse talks about the 7 days, which makes more sense because there's, right, in Eretz Yisrael, in times of, right, that the Torah is speaking about, there's 7 days of Pesach. So why does one say 6 days? And he explained, right, that has to do with the korban omer being brought. I'm not going to go into this now, right, but the omer was an offering that was brought on the 2nd day of Pesach, and from then one can eat new grain. And so he explained when it said 6 days, it meant there's 6 days where it's permissible to eat matzah from the new grain, and 7 days, right, you altogether, though, you're eating matzah. Just one of the days has to be from the old grain. But what I want to say with all of this is that we see that the korban Pesach, right, this Pesach offering seems to be an area of halacha where Hillel was very influential and involved, right? He actually became Nasi through resolving a debate around this, and we see that when he moved to Eretz Yisrael, he was influential in settling other debates or other questions around these laws. And he seems to be involved specifically, he did a lot of other things, right? We have a lot of teachings of Beit Hillel, but one of the things that he seems to be particularly involved in are the halachot of the korban Pesach. And it could be that in this context, right, in him in general being involved in dealing with halachot of the korban Pesach, that's the context in which he came to make this unique takana of how to eat it. And he came and he taught people, in addition to all these other things he taught about the korban Pesach, he taught about this is how we're going to eat it. We're going to eat it as a sandwich. We're going to eat it as the Pesach, as the matzah, and as the marror. And so that's maybe where this practice that he had came from, and we saw sort of where in the verses this discussion is coming out of, right? So it's based on the understanding of how the korban Pesach was meant to be eaten, and he added this understanding, right, this insight that it's when it says to eat it alongside these other foods, it actually should be eaten as a sandwich. So I want to touch on what we do today, and then I want to talk about what's the meaning of this sandwich, both in Hillel's time, but also importantly in our times, now that we've seen the background of this so much. So we saw, right, there was a disagreement between the sages and Chachamim, right, the sages, and Hillel, how to eat it. And Hillel would eat everything as a sandwich, and Chachamim would eat it separately. But note, all of this discussion is in the times of the temple and the time of Beit Hamikdash when we had the korban Pesach. Today, even Hillel would agree that it doesn't work to put them all together. And why is that? Because actually what happens today, in the absence of the korban Pesach, the mitzvot that we're left with are matzah and marror. But these mitzvot have different levels of status in halacha today, right? So in the time of the Beit Hamikdash, we saw in the Psukim, right, when you bring the korban Pesach, it's d'oraita, it's from the Torah, that alongside with the Pesach, you also have mitzvah obligation to eat matzah, you also have an obligation to eat marror. All those obligations were sort of on equal footing. And so then within that, we can have a discussion of, if you have mitzvah on equal footing, do they cancel each other out, or could you do them together? Once we have mitzvot that are on different levels of obligation, right, aren't on equal footing, even Hillel, who thought when they're all on the Torah level, you could eat them all together, even Hillel, when they're on different levels, he's going to agree that you can't put them together. That doesn't work. And so what happened? Today, we don't have the korban Pesach. And the only place we're told to eat marror is as an accompaniment to the korban Pesach, alongside the korban Pesach. And what that means is, basically, today, in the absence of the korban Pesach, there's no Torah obligation to eat marror. Marror was actually a condiment of the korban Pesach, right? Actually something you ate alongside of it, right? The only place we hear about it is you should eat these bitter herbs alongside your korban Pesach. When we don't have the korban Pesach, We don't actually have a Torah obligation in marror, in bitter herbs. Midrabanan, right? The sages came and said, we're still going to eat marror. But that's not a Torah level obligation. Matzah, however, we do have other. It's a machlok in the Gemara, but we hold that we do have other sources for eating matzah, and it's not only a sidekick, I would say, right? It's not only secondary to the korban Pesach, and so eating matzah today is still a Torah level obligation. And so now, when we come to our Seder, and we're not eating the korban Pesach, we have these two obligations. We have an obligation to eat matzah, that's on a Torah level. We have an obligation to eat marror, but that is only on a rabbinic level. It's not, we can't do them together. Even Hillel would agree that his practice of eating them all together, that might have worked in the times of the temple, we don't do that today because the mitzvot are in different levels. And therefore, what we need to do is, and this was the end of the Gemara that we were looking at before, but what we need to do today is we can't fulfill our obligations by eating the matzah and marror together. And so what we do is, right, we had a few steps before we got to the step of Korech. We first did our matzah and fulfilled our Torah level obligation in matzah. Then we did our marror, right, and we fulfilled our rabbinic level obligation in the bitter herbs. Okay, now that we've fulfilled all our technical obligations, right? In addition to that, now we have Korech, which is an additional step that says after you fulfilled your level of matzah, your obligation of matzah, after you fulfilled your obligation of marror, then we're going to stick them all together and eat them like a sandwich to remember what Hillel did in temple times. But we can't actually fulfill the obligation of matzah or the obligation of marror in this way. So we have to do each step separately. And then we have an additional step that the sages instituted, right, where we eat them together. And that's why we've already made our bracha, right? We made a bracha when we did the mitzvah of matzah. We made our bracha when we did the mitzvah of marror. Now we're going to come and eat them together. And why are we eating together? To remember, right? It's what's called zecher lemikdash, to remember what was done in temple times. And in temple times, right, Hillel didn't have steps of marror and matzah, right? In the temple times, Hillel would put them all together and eat them all together. So now for us, what we do is once we've eaten our matzah and once we've eaten our marror, then we're going to put them together to remember the way Hillel ate it in the time of the Mikdash. And I was thinking how it's interesting that we do specific. There's another opinion, right, which was Chachamim. We just do everything separately, so we could have just left it at that, right? But why are we doing specifically like Hillel? And I think Hillel, right? In Hillel, that's where we see that we're actually missing something today, that we don't have the korban Pesach. Because if we had matzah and we did it, and we had marror and we did it, we skipped Pesach, no one would know, right? Only when you say, oh, Hillel used to make a sandwich of these three things, then you hear about, wait, there was supposed to be another thing here, right? So it's really Zecher LeMikdash to remember only Hillel makes it really clear that the Pesach is missing. And that's Zecher LeMikdash, right? To remember what we would have had we been in the temple times. Okay, we have 11 minutes left. In our last 11 minutes, let's try to understand what the meaning of putting them together. So we saw, hopefully, right, there's a lot of information, but hopefully a lot of background about this discussion and where this idea of making a sandwich came from, what the Seder really looked like in the temple times, and how Hillel got, right, and what we do today, which is to recall that it looked like that in the temple times, in addition to our other obligations we're fulfilling, we're going to make this sandwich. What's the meaning of eating them together? Okay, so I started by looking at the different commentaries on this verse about eating the korban Pesach together with matzah and marror, and specifically with regard to the bitter herbs that the korban Pesach is eaten with. I saw sort of different approaches in the commentaries. Why are we eating the korban Pesach along with bitter herbs? So Rashi says, and I think this is right how most of us think about the bitter herbs. Rashi says we eat bitter herbs in order to remember v'meruth chayehem, right? We eat their bitter herbs, we saw this from Rabban Gamliel, to remember the bitterness of slavery, to remember how the Egyptian slave masters, right, made the lives of our ancestors bitter. And so because we want to remember this, we eat it alongside of the marror. We eat the marror alongside of the korban Pesach. Okay, interestingly, the Ibn Ezra just suggests, and this is interesting, right? They're sitting in Egypt when they're doing their original korban Pesach, and he suggests this is how the meals were actually eaten there, right? Sort of like how I said it's a condiment, but he says be specifically because of, and I don't know explain his science behind it, but because of the weather in Egypt, right, or different factors about the moisture of the Nile, the custom was to eat bitter herbs or mustards or things like that along with a meal. They always had bitter things there. And so he said, had it not been for the suggestion that we have in Chachamim that we're doing it to remember the bitterness, I would have just said it's actually that's how the meals were done in Egypt when this original command is being given. So that was interesting. The Chizkuni takes a really interesting approach. And we have to remember that the original command of the Korban Pesach, part of the idea over there, is that the lamb, right, or the sheep was actually something the Egyptians worshipped. And the whole idea here is to kind of counter that belief, right? We're going to bring a sacrifice from your, so to speak, God. And the point is to show that it's not really a God. And to show instead that we have emunah, we believe in God. And so he says, right, and there's a lot of elements that people talk about with regard to this, right? That's why they have to bring the lamb into their home for 3 days and all sorts of things. But he says the bitter herbs, right, adding bitter herbs into the mix was actually part of this because the bitter herbs was meant to sort of degrade the wait, I'm just looking at I feel like the English here is not literally so translating it. I'm gonna read inside for a second. Immurim. You should eat your korban pesach together with bitter herbs. Koze derech bizayon sheyochluhu in davar ra. This is a way of degrading the korban pesach. Degrading, actually, the way the sheep is supposed to be eaten is in a way that degrades it. You're supposed to eat it very quickly, for example. And he says you're also supposed to eat it along with something bitter. And the point is actually to show disrespect to the sheep, and that is because the Egyptians worship the sheep, and we're trying to show our steadfast belief in God. So the way of eating, according to the Chizkuni, we're not going to eat it in a pleasant or nice or fancy way. We're not going to eat it with something important or something sweet. But I think there's a mistake in the English here now that I didn't look at the translation. I just looked at the source in Hebrew. So I don't know. Stay along with me in the Hebrew for a minute. But he says we're not going to eat it with something nice or something fancy or something sweet. We're going to actually eat it in a way that degrades it. And one of those things is throwing in these bitter herbs, right? So like imagine if you threw in like a spice that made your meal taste bad, right? That totally didn't go or was too spicy or something like that, right? Some people like spicy, so I'm not sure what example to give, right? But if you threw in something that totally didn't belong there to sort of ruin the dish, so Chizkuni says that's actually the point. We're trying to ruin the dish because we're trying to show disrespect towards the sheep that we're bringing. This is interesting. And the Orach Chaim actually almost goes in the opposite direction. The Orach Chaim says this is how, when we eat the Korban Pesach, we're trying to show freedom. And what does freedom mean? Freedom means we're going to have a nice, fancy meal. And you know what you have at a nice, fancy meal? The Egyptians, says the Orach Chaim, would roast this meat, and they would eat it alongside with bitter herbs. There's an idea, right, of these bitter herbs sort of whetting the appetite or kind of enhancing the, right, people who know more about culinary arts or cooking, right, can sort of think about this. But right, there's an idea of bringing out flavor, and one of the ways to bring out the flavor actually of the roast is to have this contrasting taste of the bitter herb. And so actually, right, the Orach Chaim says we're trying to show we're so free, we're eating such a fine meal, we want it to be so enjoyable, and to make an impression on us, we're gonna complement it. And in this way, right here, I've used this term previously, but I think the Orach Chaim is really looking at it this way. The bitter herbs are really a condiment that goes with your lamb that you're eating that night, and enhances your experience of it, and enhances the flavor. Okay, so the different approaches, right, is this, why are we adding in these bitter herbs? Does it make it taste better? Does it make it taste worse, right? Is it something degrading? Is it something, a sign of freedom? Is it remembering bitterness? Or is it actually showing, this is how we eat a big fancy meal? Okay, to end off on, we're not going to read the sources inside. I'm skipping over the Ramban. The Ramban was just a nice sort of summary of what we do today. But let me mention a few a little bit more modern thinkers on, or right, a few commentaries on the mitzvah of Korech. What does the sandwich symbolize? And so, according to Rav Hirsch, all the elements of the sandwich, the Pesach, the matzah, and the marror, all symbolize slavery, right? The matzah is because they didn't have time to bake the bread, both while they're going out of Egypt, but he says actually prior to that also they wouldn't have had time, right? They have slave taskmasters, on their backs. They don't have time. They're eating matzah earlier, even in Egypt. So that's a sign of the slavery. The marror, of course, is a sign of the torment and the bitterness. And he says the Pesach actually also is, and why has the Pesach represent slavery according to Rav Hirsch? So he says the Pesach was roasted on a spit, and if you imagine it, right, it's not on firm ground. And so he says this Pesach being moved around and roasted on this spit over the fire is representative of being strangers in a land. You don't have a firm place. You're just driven around. And he says we eat these foods together to remember that even up until the exact moment that God took us out, we were in terrible, terrible situation. We had all these horrible elements of slavery, right? The bitterness, the having no time to ourselves, having no place. And it's only because God comes in and he grants us freedom. That's why we're able to get out, right? We would have been slaves. We were slaves. We had no way out. Everything was so bad till that last moment. But Yeshuat Hashem Kerafai, and in a moment, God comes in and he's able to free us. And so in order to remember the absolute hand of God here, we recount these three aspects of our slavery. And so that's how Rav Hirsch looks at this. And so really this whole sandwich is like a slave sandwich, right? A sandwich that's meant to remind us of our slavery. Why remind us of our slavery? To appreciate the freedom that we got to, but a sandwich that reminds us of our slavery. The Chizkuni talks about these three as actually being contrasting elements. And he says he sees it as we're taking different elements that represent different things we're putting together. And he sees the matzah, for example, and the Pesach also as a sign of our freedom. And we're taking our Pesach and our matzah and our freedom, and we're eating that together with our bitterness, which is also interesting, right? He's saying we're taking these opposite elements and we're drawing them together. And what he's saying is now, even now that we're remembering our freedom, we have to remember the bitter times around that. Put a little bit of bitter herbs on top of that. It's important that when we're talking about our salvation to also remember when things were bad, right? And we can think about why. And there's a bunch of different reasons why, right? Without that contrast between the bitterness and the freedom, we wouldn't really know how great the freedom was. That's part of it, right? Part of what's going on is we appreciate our freedom in light of the bitterness, right? So that contrast in flavors in your dish, if you will, right, is what reminds us how bad things were, how much better they got. We can fully appreciate the picture by Dafka taking them all, sandwiching them all together, having them all at once. And another thing is, right, we have this idea of we want to remember God in all situations. It's easy to remember God when things are good, right? But we want to remember that even when things are bad, God is with us. And so we take the good, the matzah, but we also take the marror, the bad. And in this moment, we're about to thank God for our freedom and we're going to praise God. We want to tell ourselves, you also remember God in the bitterness. And we're going to put them all together and we're going to remember God in all of those situations. Right? And unfortunately, Jewish history really has been marked by a lot of periods of the marror, of the bitterness. We also have periods of the matzah, right, of the better times. But the point is that we want to understand that all of this was from God and that Hashem was with us in all times. And we come on Seder night and we confirm that our commitment to God is absolute, right? We trust him. That even when we can see his goodness, certainly, but even through the bitterness, and our Jewish faith is throughout all of them, throughout the whole sandwich, throughout, right, whatever life throws at us, in the bitter sections, in the less bitter sections. And I'll just mention one final aspect. Rav Kook talks about a few different ideas here, but I'll bring one. Rav Kook talks about Hillel as sort of a synthesizer, as a uniting force in the Jewish people. Someone who he describes him in the terms that we often describe Aaron HaKohen, and he loved peace and he chased after peace and he loved people and he was bringing them all together, and describes Hillel as sort of bringing the light of the Geulah, the redemption, to sweeten the bitterness of the galut. And so we're not going to just eat the marror, but we're going to eat it together with the matzah. And he goes on to talk about, right, the cause of galut, the cause of exile, is disagreement amongst the Jewish people, what he calls milchemet achim, right? Different people who are supposed to be brothers fighting. And what we have to do is find peace. And we have to find unity amongst all parts of the Jewish people. And you can see a sandwich, right, as drawing on all different types of elements, right? There's the marror, and there's the matzah, and there's maybe some charoset in there, and the korban Pesach. We're going to bring it all together. And that was Hillel. And that was what he was trying to accomplish, was unite all these distinct parts. So that's another understanding of why we're eating a sandwich that brings together different elements. So that was sort of three different approaches, right? The sandwich is either a slave sandwich, and we're remembering all the bitter elements of slavery, and thinking about the messages that's supposed to have for our night. Or, right, the sandwich is actually about uniting these different elements, and remembering that we see God in all of them, remembering that all different types of people are part, right? All of those elements have to be brought together in redemption. So both in the good times to remember the bad, but also in the bad times to bring in light by remembering the good, and sort of this synthesis of all of these elements together. That is our Korech sandwich. Wishing everybody a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.